Welcome, students. This is Mr. Bockold here. I'm going to review the first part of March Book 3. So let's go ahead and kind of step back a little bit and understand what March Book 3 is about. March Book 3 is about the story that led up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a landmark civil rights and labor law that outlines discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and later that included sexual orientation and gender equality. Now, that was signed into law by President Johnson in 1964. And it wasn't being enforced across the rest of the United States until the marches in Selma. You saw the documentary last time where John Lewis led those marches across the Selma Bridge. There were three marches, actually. The first one was Bloody Sunday, then Turnaround Tuesday, and then the final march where they were actually able to march all the way down to the Capitol. So that's what this book is about. So let's go ahead and talk about how it started, or how it starts. So this book starts September 15th, 1963. This is 18 days after the March on Washington, in which John Lewis and Martin Luther King, among several others, gave their speeches in front of the White House. And Martin Luther King did his famous I Have a Dream speech. So 18 days later, we have the bombing of on 16th Street Baptist Church. And this bombing killed 4 black girls. It injured another one. Throughout the day in the same town in Birmingham, there were more attacks. Some white teenagers shot two boys. They were killed. And furthermore, when police were roaming the streets after all the madness, a police officer shot and killed another 16-year-old boy, and he was never indicted on that. So lots of tragedy on that day. So Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and many other civil rights activists come to Birmingham to participate in the funerals. Martin Luther King gives this eulogy, and he says, "They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murders." And they all knew what Martin Luther King meant. They needed to change the entire system. And to change the system, they needed to ensure that all black people could vote. Now, the Constitution prohibited people or cities, municipalities, and states from discriminating against people based on their race to vote. But there were a lot of laws in the South that didn't say black people couldn't vote, but they systematically prevented and targeted a lot of black people from voting. You saw that in the documentary last time. There were poll taxes that many black people couldn't pay. There were literacy tests that were much more difficult for black Americans. Oftentimes, the white Americans didn't get those. You saw the counting bubbles in a bar of soap and ludicrous tests, very difficult tests that prevented systematically black people from voting. So I want to go back now to Birmingham, letter from Birmingham jail. So this was before the Martin Luther King and John Lewis on DC. This is before the I Have a Dream speech. Now, if you remember in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King talked about the purpose of direct action or protesting. And he said in his letter, and I'm quoting, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." So in order to get more people to vote, these activists got together and they decided to target a town in Alabama. Now, remember, Alabama is the most segregated state in the South. It's where George Wallace famously said for his inauguration speech, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." So Selma is already in the most segregated state, and Selma is a very segregated city in a very segregated county. So activists specifically chose Selma because of its huge population of black Americans. Furthermore, they knew that this guy right here, Jim Clark, he is the sheriff of Dallas County. And they knew that if activists went and protested for their rights to register to vote in Dallas County, in Selma, in Alabama, this guy, Jim Clark, would do something about it. It would create tension. And Martin Luther King, when he came to Selma, he brought the media, and the media would be there to catch the subsequent dramatic violence that occurred. Okay, so now the plan is to go to Selma and to get people registered to vote. So John Lewis, he comes, he's a member of SNCC, which is SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He comes, Martin Luther King comes, and several other people come to get people registered to vote. And the first thing that they do is they go to the courthouses and they start protesting and demonstrating in front of the courthouses, trying to bring awareness to the systemic issues at hand. All of the barriers that were preventing Black citizens from registering to vote. 30 people were arrested, so they get together. John Lewis is there. Remember his one man, one vote. They made even larger demonstrations, and John Lewis, of course, police show up. It was violent, and John Lewis is arrested with many others. Now, if you watched the documentary last time, you saw footage of John Lewis being led into a bus. He was arrested then. So later, what they decided to do is try to get as many Black people as they could to vote. So they lined up on one of the few days that they were allowed to register to vote. They had people wrapped around the building in line in front of the Dallas County Courthouse to register to vote. It was a very hot day in the summer. And of course, we know the police showed up, and they made sure that these law-abiding citizens standing in line to register to vote, they were harassed and discouraged from voting. You had the mayor show up, and he's in charge of the troopers that day. He verbally accosted them. He told them they were not allowed to get out of line, that they couldn't use the restrooms, that they just had to stand outside in the heat, and it became a battle of wills. Now, SNCC, members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they wanted to bring water and food to the people standing in line, but they couldn't. And when they did, two members of SNCC came over, they brought in water, and they were beat. The press got it, and the press was actually beat. Later, at 4:30, the courthouse closed. Only a few people, I believe 4 people, were able to register to vote that day, and the courthouse was closed. So you can see that Black people in the 1960s were and for generations before that, were systematically denied their right to vote. And the white power structure knew that if Black people had the access to the ballot, that they could totally change the way America looked. And they did everything they could to present that. Now, November 22nd, 1963, another day that will live in infamy in American history, John F. Kennedy, the President of the United States, is shot in broad daylight. He's assassinated. He's killed in his motorcade. And remember that JFK was an ally to the civil rights activists. So this was a huge blow to the civil rights activists. They were worried. Now, when a president dies, the vice president takes charge, and that is President Lyndon Johnson. So now he becomes the default president of the United States. And the civil rights activists were a little bit worried about him. They were trepidatious about him because Lyndon Johnson, while he was on their side, he was an ally of getting Black people to vote. He wasn't a fan of the demonstrations. And so he was constantly asking the demonstrations to cease. The demonstrations continue despite President Johnson's request that they stop, because they knew that the activists, John Lewis included, knew that the protest needed to continue to gain traction. So the protests continue. December of 1963, John Lewis is now in Atlanta, in Georgia, and they're doing tons of demonstrations there, the sit-ins. He's once again arrested. I can't count how many times John Lewis has been arrested, but these demonstrations did work in Alabama. The campaign worked, and in a few months, these restaurants integrated establishments, including those in Atlanta. So they are beginning to work, but it's taken years of civil rights activism to get up to this point. So now what you're going to do is you're going to read. You've got the reading assignment there. You're going to continue to read the civil rights activists and John Lewis now. They're going to talk about the backstory to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then this next part of the reading, President Johnson is going to come through on his promise. He's going to sign that into law. However, just like many of the Supreme Court rulings, just because it happens in Washington and in D.C., and the Supreme Court and the federal government says this is the direction our country is going, we've got tons of southern states who are going to act in defiance to the federal courts and the White House. They're going to dig in their heels, and they're going to refuse to allow people to register to vote despite this new legislation. So John Lewis is going to continue to get together and provide more activism, more creative tension, as Martin Luther King would say. And this next section, it's going to get uncomfortable. There's going to be a lot of violence in it. I read it just earlier today, and even though I've read it before, I know what happens, and there's a lot of uncomfortable ideas and topics in here. So, folks, continue reading. You've got your next section. This one, I'm going to give you 20 points on this one because there's going to be a lot of reading, and it's the only reading assignment you have this week. So, as always, this is Mr. Bockel. Keep reading, keep learning.